Hey everyone, this is Natalie Ivey, and I'm excited about today's episode, Gen Z at Work, Workplace Priorities and Employee Relations Red Flags. I have a special guest on my show today, Madison Ebben, who is actually my assistant and event manager here at RPC Human Resources. Madison is a Gen Zer, and she and I are going to talk a bit of shop about employee relations with Gen Zs, what they want and what they don't want, and we're going to discuss some best practices for improving employee engagement.
Welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast, exploring the issues, challenges, strategies, and solutions. Sponsored by RPCHR and hosted by Natalie Ivey, an HR consultant, licensed PI, and author of the best-selling book, How to Conduct Internal Investigations, a practical guide for human resource professionals. And now, here's Natalie.
Hey everybody, I'm Natalie Ivey, and welcome to the HR Investigations Podcast. I am really excited today because I have somebody very special who is on my show today, and her name is Madison Ebben. And Madison is actually my executive assistant and event manager here at RPC Human Resources. Madison's a Gen Zer, and we had some discussion about Gen Z at work, and we thought, let's not just stop there. Why don't we make it a podcast? So here we are. So we're going to take a look at some of the things that Gen Z really is looking for in the workplace and some things that Gen Z just definitely doesn't want in the workplace. And this is going to be a discussion today that will help you understand Gen Z a little bit more and improve your employee engagement. So before we get into talking a little bit of shop, I'd like to just turn this over to Madison and just have her jump in here and share a little bit about her background. And then we're going to delve in and talk all things Gen Z. So Madison, talk to us a little bit about where you came from before you started working with us.
Hi there. So I started learning about HR in college. I went to Texas A&M University, and I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. At first, I thought maybe accounting, but I quickly realized I'm a people person, and I didn't want to just sit behind a desk and not talk to anyone all day. So human resources seemed like more my style. So I got my business management degree and I concentrated on human resources. And right after college, I started in my first full-time job. I was the HR administrative assistant and eventually worked my way up to the HR coordinator. I learned a lot in college about HR, but I was excited to kind of take what I learned in school and actually apply that to the real world. So at this first job I had, we were a pretty small HR department. There was 2 of us. And so we kind of had our hands in a little bit of everything. Everything that HR encompasses, we were in it because we're just so small. So we did a little bit of recruiting. We did performance management, open enrollment, benefits, and we did a pretty good job as a team. And we eventually added a third person who was our recruiter. And that gave us a little bit more time to dive into some of the other stuff. I think one of our biggest goals in that department was to kind of break down the barrier between HR and the employees. And I feel like a lot of employees view the HR department as scary. Oh, HR is here. Who's getting fired today? And we wanted to kind of break that down and help them to realize that we were quite literally a resource to them. And we wanted to, when we were there visiting, we wanted them to be willing to come to us with questions and view us as a resource. So I felt like we did a good job of that. A few years later, I got an opportunity to join another company as their HR manager. They were a much smaller organization and didn't have an HR department. So I was happy to, take on a new challenge and start an HR department from the ground up. And that's where I'm currently at. On the side, I help Natalie with RPCHR, and we plan events, and I help her with her class organization and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, fantastic. I know it's been wonderful having you on board, and you've been with us for about a year, and it's been just a great experience in having you with me. So with that, let's go ahead and talk about Gen Z a little bit. So since you are a Gen Zer, let's kind of define a little bit about kind of Gen Z. What are some of the characteristics of Gen Z that the rest of our listening audience really needs to know about? And particularly leaders in HR, what do we need to know about Gen Z?
Generation Z were individuals born between 1997 and 2012. I was born in 98, so I kind of fall right at the beginning of that generation. I kind of laugh to myself about generations because they span over a decade usually. The people born in 1997 are going to have a much different upbringing than those born in 2012. It's just kind of funny. But these people coming into the workforce in this generation, they grew up with more technology than previous generations. So they grew up with smartphones are becoming popular, internet, social media, all that fun stuff. So they're a very tech savvy generation, which in today's day and age is a great thing because the world is becoming much more innovative and technology driven. And so now we have a new generation of workers that are comfortable with that. They're comfortable learning new technology and using AI and all of that in the workforce. And so it's a generation that isn't afraid to implement that. And I think leaders and HR professionals need to be adaptable and learn to utilize these resources that we now have at our fingertips that this generation is so comfortable using.
So when we think about the different generations other than Gen Zs, I mean, obviously we have the baby boomers that are still very much in the workplace. A lot of them are now starting to look at retirement, but we still have boomers that are there, and some folks, quite frankly, are wanting to hang around a little bit longer. For a variety of reasons. Their portfolios may not necessarily be where they want them to be for their retirement portfolio, so they're working longer. And then you have Gen Xers and then also the millennial generation, which is now really a pretty big chunk of the U.S. workforce. The millennials, many of them are now, the older millennials are in the managerial ranks. Many of them are at even executive levels, have aspired to that. So with that, though, it sometimes can create a little bit of challenge, can't it? You have some of the folks that may be in the boomer or older Xer generation that don't necessarily see eye to eye with maybe the use of technology and some of those things. So can you speak to that? Maybe some of the folks who were listening been in HR a while, and you may be a little concerned about just kind of the speed at which things are changing with technology and kind of speaking from a Gen Z and what you think they need to do to adapt.
It's our nature to be afraid of change. And I think people need to learn how to be a little bit more comfortable with that. And hopefully people in leadership positions are kind of starting to adapt to this ever-changing world with technology and such. Actually, interesting, I went to the National SHRM conference last year, and AI was a huge topic while I was at that conference. And one thing that kind of stuck with me that they said was, it's not AI that's going to take your job. It's somebody that knows how to use AI that's going to take your job. So people might be afraid of this technology coming and everything, but you got to learn to use it or it's going to, they're going to push you out.
Yeah, I think what happens is our generation, and I'm somebody who's known as a cusper because my birth year was early 1967, and so I'm sometimes, but depending on the literature you look at, I might be considered a boomer. Other literature, I am a Gen Xer. But we grew up with kind of the Terminator Rise of the Machines, and I think that is part of why some people who are perhaps in my age bracket, they may be a little frightened about some of this AI stuff that's kind of coming up. But truly, I imagine if we look back when we were really developing the internet, I mean, it's really interesting. I had a conversation the other day with someone about dial-up, and I remember long before we even had the internet. I mean, we just grew. We just did not function with it. We did not have mobile phones. We did not have internet. And so when the internet really became very prevalent and we began to do things in very different ways, I mean, back in the day, it was you submitted your resume and it was you mailed your resume in, right? So think about we've gone from, it's almost like Alexander Graham Bell to the iPhone, but in HR, we've gone from mailing resumes in with a stamp on it to now it's literally pushing an app on your phone and then, submitting it, right? I think the essence of what we really need to convey here to our listening audience is that we've got to be flexible, we've got to be adaptable, but also I think it's creating very much a learning culture. And what some of our client base is doing, as you know, Madison, and for our audience, there are a lot of them that are really working on the development of their team members internally. And that means their managers in helping them to adapt. And that means you've got to create some specific learning interventions for your leaders to get them comfortable. As an example, recently I was working with a group of managers for one of our clients that's in the energy sector, and they really had no idea how to use the dictation tool in Word. They just didn't know. They just didn't even really know it existed, right? And for us, and if we're working in HR day in and day out, we do a lot of documentation, and so that's a very simple thing for us. Or simply going to Chat GPT, perhaps to work on a job description or make some edits. We're beginning to look for unique ways that we can use that. There are a lot of managers out there that really don't even know what ChatGPT is, as an example, right? And how AI can actually shortcut. What was interesting when I worked with that group of managers, there were so many ahas. Oh my gosh, I can talk at the computer and it can help me craft oh my gosh, there was this just kind of that revelation. All right. So I think that that's one key takeaway here from our podcast. So now, Madison, let's change gears a little bit. And I'd like you to speak to really what Gen Zs are looking for, being a Gen Z, and also just, with your peer group and things that you talk about. What are they looking for from their employers?
Yeah, I think going on from the technology aspect and them being, willing to bring that into the workforce and stuff, they're also craving mentorship and opportunities to learn from others. While maybe they have the technology aspect, they still crave that mentorship and want to learn from their peers and supervisors, perhaps. Going off of that, they are also seeming to want more and more of the continuous feedback versus just the annual performance review. This generation of individuals, they don't want to wait till the end of the year to figure out where they stand in the organization. They want to know where they stand at all times. And I think that's a beneficial thing, because an annual performance review shouldn't be this scary thing that comes at the end of the year. You should know what's going to happen during that review if your manager is doing a good job of giving you that continuous feedback. So I think that's a big thing. And we're also seeing more and more of the desire for a flexible workplace, flexible schedule, remote and hybrid options becoming more and more important to them. Obviously, in some organizations, that's just not possible. But I think for the types of roles where it is, that's becoming very important to them with, a work-life balance and that flexible work schedule.
Yeah, absolutely. And so one of the things that is important about that kind of work-life balance piece is an episode that I recently had on the show was HR Recharge and prioritizing making ourselves kind of first. And one of the things that I spoke to in that podcast, and I'll talk a little bit about it here, it really just kind of fits in with our discussion here, is our profession is 70% female. That's kind of the latest statistic from SHRM. And with that said, women tend to really take on more and more and more. And so when businesses are really growing, and they're growing sometimes very quickly, what can happen is a capacity problem. And that work-life balance that is so very important, as you just said, especially to Gen Zs, that can suddenly now get a little out of whack. And one of the things that I'll tell you, even before I had my podcast just a short time ago on the HR Recharge podcast, but I was talking about this years ago with what is called job design. And I think HR really needs to start paying attention to this because of what you tapped into, Madison, about Gen Zs and desiring that. So it is the mentorship. Yes, they're excited. They want to learn more and they want to be developed. But the one thing that I think is a very distinct difference between the Gen Zs and my generation would very much compromise our own personal time a lot more so. And to a certain degree, this is where maybe boomers and Xers might kind of take a few snarky shots at the Gen Zers by saying, oh, I don't have a work ethic. All right. I can tell you there are certain pockets of, our client base and in just my professional contacts where that is indeed an issue. There are some issues around work ethic. There are a lot more younger people who do call out work. Right, they do. They will prioritize going to a concert, or they're going to take a day off just because they want to go shoe shopping, and they will call off work a lot more frequently than the previous generations did. Well, let me tell you a couple of reasons why. Well, first of all, back when it was my generation, you physically had to actually talk to your boss before you were going to call off. You couldn't just text in. So that's one thing. But the other piece of this is our generation, we were just a lot more concerned about, well, if I do call off work and if I do that, okay, the job market wasn't necessarily as open as it is now. Today we have so many more options for your generation, which is gig work. I mean, you could leave a job and still survive. If you've got technology capability, you could do gig work for a while and work for 2, 3, 4 different freelance businesses, and you're still going to be able to make the rent. You see, there's a lot more capability that Gen Zs have just simply because of the technology. So that's one of the big differences. But the other thing, too, is that our generation did sacrifice a lot more. I can honestly say there were many times that I just sort of sucked it up and I just kept working, even though I really compromised maybe some of the personal leisure time that I really wanted to have. And, being a woman also, I grew up in a male-dominated environment. So I also had to kind of, back in the day, maybe work a little bit harder at that. It was just kind of, but that's one big thing. So yes, there is a work ethic piece, but I also do think that, and honestly, I admire the Gen Zs in having maybe some firmer boundaries in that when organizations are pushing people into really ridiculous capacity situations where they're way, way over capacity, and that work in life is at the point where really there is no life. That's the problem, okay? I think that everyone should certainly put in and be productive and to work that full work week. This notion of, oh, well, I'm just going to take off this afternoon because, well, I'm just going to do yoga all afternoon. Okay, well, if you're going to do that, then you should be plugging into the laptop that evening in order to finish your work deadlines. If you're going to do that, that's that work-life flexibility. If your yoga class is important to you, then fine. But, what we have to make sure of as HR professionals is that the job descriptions we have today, they've got to be organized with a better job design. I mean, and when I say design, I'm also talking about capacity. If you have a situation where some of your positions, a person is really doing the work of 1.5 FTEs, that's a problem. You've got somebody consistently working, that's about 60 hours a work week. That's kind of nuts. Yeah. That's not sustainable.
I agree, definitely.
Let's talk about some of the things now from an employee relations standpoint that Gen Z just isn't going to tolerate that maybe some previous generations may have. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Like we were talking about the work-life balance, that's a big thing. And I've also kind of found it interesting over time, the older generations, they had a little bit more loyalty to their companies and stuck around for maybe their entire career or 20, 30 years. And we're seeing the younger individuals, if they're not seeing that growth or getting that flexibility they want, then they're fine leaving in 2 to 3 years. The loyalty is definitely a bit different than it once was. So that's kind of interesting. They, want the clear career paths. They want to see that there's a chance for them to make something of themselves at the organization they're at. And like we talked about earlier, they're also really desiring that frequent feedback and that coaching.
Yeah, so I think when we look at what they're not going to be jazzed about is the fact that they may have a leader that just doesn't really communicate with them, doesn't set clear expectations, doesn't really help to understand what they need from the standpoint of resources to support them. If they're not providing them the appropriate mentorship and the guidance, that's a problem. And so that kind of goes back to what I said with job design today and capacity. And I can tell you, because we do, as you know, Madison, we do an awful lot of management training. And one of the biggest things that I'm hearing from supervisors is they have very little time to actually supervise their employees. They're busy working and doing the job. Okay, that's a problem. I mean, how can you, kind of be the boss when you're supposed to be the boss, but yet you're there turning a wrench, maybe like in a tech job, and you're supervising technicians. You're really not supervising, and that's part of what's being really kind of not looked upon, I think, as thoughtfully as it needs to be in HR. We've really got to take a look, not just at job description, but we've got to look at also how we've had kind of job description creep with some of the jobs over time. We have to look at capacity, the design of the job, even some functions. If a poor manager is barely able to just meet with each of their team members on a monthly basis, that's a job design that's just flipping broken. And, so I hear a lot of people talking about employee engagement today and retention and all of this stuff. And okay, we can do the gimmicky stuff. We can get a foosball machine. We can do some of that stuff. And yes, those are some morale boosters. But let me tell you this. Employees that are really just growing very weary because they feel like they're pulled in a lot of different directions. They feel like their job doesn't necessarily make sense, or they definitely are not getting enough face time and that feedback from their boss. Gen Z is, I'm sure, not going to put up with that.
And I think you and I have talked about several times, a lot of the managers that get put into the positions they're in, they're oftentimes just thrown into those positions and don't get the proper training. And to the audience, I've taken Natalie's training classes. We had her and Ken come into the organization I used to work for, and she did management training for all of our, lower level managers, even the executive managers. And I think just getting some of that knowledge that maybe they were never trained on is so beneficial. There's so much stuff they had never heard of when it comes to HR and managing people. And so I think that was a very, very big success in that organization.
I definitely saw that. There was a lot of learning that took place there and a lot of behavior change and also risk reduction, because there were a lot of them that were really, really unaware of some of the regulatory issues as well. Kind of a nice segue on that in, focusing on employee relations. Certainly, when we look at businesses today, every organization certainly should have policies in their employee handbook or employer manual that prohibit things like discrimination, harassment, retaliation. And this is also one of the things for our listening audience. And if you're in HR, you need to hear me on this. If you're not really providing your managers with an understanding of the policies that you have in your own handbook, you have no idea when they're out there day in and day out supervising their employees, some of the things that they're saying and doing that is maybe working even against your engagement initiatives. So HR can be working over here on cool things like Food Truck Fridays or foosball or better benefits or working on compensation strategies and things like that. But, the old saying, people really don't leave organizations, they leave their managers. That's very true. So we've got to get it straight with the design of the managers' jobs. We've got to help them understand also our policies and what they're supposed to be doing to enforce them on a day-to-day basis, like how not to just be a supervisor who kind of chimes in with a group of employees who are really kind of talking smack about somebody else, and now they're really crossing over boundaries and even being discriminatory or harassing someone. Sometimes managers think, laughing and joshing and joking around in the break room with their employees. Sometimes they think that that's kind of what they're supposed to do because they just want people to like them. And then they're out there completely doing things that are counterintuitive to your values, your culture, your policies, right? So we've got to get better at that. If you want to hang on to your Gen Z talent, they're not going to put up with that. They want to work in organizations where people are treated fairly, they're respected, they're valued. And as Madison, you said, they want to have some mentorship and some development as well. So if you've got some leaders that really don't understand the fundamentals of just being a supervisor or a manager, you're missing the mark with your Gen Z talent. So if we think about kind of in summary, 3 things that leaders need to do to really fully engage their Gen Z talent. So first one is technology. You got to embrace the technology. What do you think the second thing is, Madison?
Yeah, I think creating that flexible and healthy work environment. So supporting, if possible, flexible schedule, promoting a work-life balance or wellness programs, stuff like that. And then fostering a culture of trust and not micromanaging when you don't have to. I think that's another really important key. And just leading with authenticity. Ensure that your leaders are communicating openly and honestly with their individuals. I mean, the people don't want you just as a leader blowing smoke.
I completely get it. And, with that, the last thing I want to mention is that's also one of those skills that a lot of leaders who get thrown into the job, they don't know how to do that. They haven't really learned the mechanics of how to have a good feedback and one-on-one discussion with their employees to really talk with them and setting clear expectations. They also really don't know how to follow up and have the feedback when maybe, the employee needs a little bit of course correction. They're not necessarily where they need to be. There are some managers that just don't know how to do that well. They may put it off. They're crazy busy. And then when maybe there are mistakes or things go wrong, now they'll bark at the employee. They get mad, they get exasperated. And now, guess what? That employee's probably in HR lodging a complaint of hostile work environment. Even though that's not really a hostile work environment, they'll package it up that way, or it turns into some sort of a bullying complaint, right? So, this is the stuff that we see over and over and over again, and across all industry sectors. There isn't any one industry that I see this show up, but what I will tell you, it does seem to be a lot more in like smaller to medium sized organizations. Larger businesses tend to have a little bit more investment in the leadership development space. But even then, I have had conversations with some friends of mine who are CHROs and HR execs, and they're still even seeing it in some of their businesses because there are a lot of leaders that still just continue to promote based on just technical capability, not necessarily someone's soft skills and their people skills. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. So, Madison, I really appreciate you being with me today. And I think our listening audiences appreciated learning from a Gen Z. I hope that you've enjoyed today's podcast and have some really, really great takeaways. So that's it for us. And I look forward to seeing you all back at another HR Investigations podcast. See ya.
Thanks for joining us today on the HR Investigations Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, like, and share the show with any colleagues who will benefit from our strategies and solutions. For free bonus resources, simply visit hr-investigations.com. And remember, if you'd like some help with improving your investigative skills, or if your organization is in need of an external investigator to help with a case, please get in touch with us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.